The fluorescent lights of the courtroom flickered coldly as the murmur of the crowd filled the space. In the center of the room sat a 15-year-old black boy named Elijah Carter. He was slender, with intense brown eyes that observed everything around him with a calmness that sharply contrasted the tense atmosphere. Wearing a simple button-up shirt and worn-out jeans, Elijah seemed out of place in that setting, but there was something about him, perhaps his posture or his confident expression, that defied expectations. Presiding over the courtroom was Judge Margaret Blake, a stern woman in her early 50s, known for her no-nonsense approach. Seated high above, she meticulously flipped through documents. Her expression carried skepticism, but also a hint of curiosity. After all, Elijah wasn't the usual defendant. Beside Elijah stood his court-appointed attorney, Amanda Hayes, a young lawyer in her early 30s who exuded nervousness. This was the first truly challenging case of her career, and she knew the odds were against them. Opposing them was Daniel Morgan, a veteran prosecutor renowned for his ability to manipulate courtroom narratives. "Shall we begin?" Judge Blake's sharp voice silenced the courtroom immediately. The case was complex. Elijah had been accused of hacking into a corporate database to expose a fraud network involving influential politicians and businessmen in Seattle. The charges were severe: cyber intrusion, theft of confidential information, and even conspiracy to defame. What made this case extraordinary was the fact that Elijah had done it alone, using nothing but an old laptop he had salvaged from a nearby junkyard. "Your Honor," Amanda began, attempting to project confidence, "this case is not just about the charges. It's about a brilliant young man whose only motivation was to seek justice. Elijah had no intention of causing harm or personal gain." "Intentions don't change the fact that crimes were committed," Prosecutor Morgan interjected, his tone smug. He looked directly at Elijah. The boy knew exactly what he was doing. "Excuse me," Elijah spoke for the first time, his voice calm yet carrying a surprising authority. He stood slowly, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "Can I explain what I did and why I did it?" Judge Blake raised her eyebrows, visibly intrigued. "You have the right to speak, but I suggest you consult your attorney first." Amanda hesitated, looking at Elijah, but he gave her a subtle nod, signaling that he knew what he was doing. Reluctantly, she agreed. Elijah stepped forward, took a deep breath, and began. "I grew up in Rainier Valley, a neighborhood in Seattle where people struggle every day to survive. My mom works 2 jobs, and even then, we can barely pay the bills. I knew something was wrong when the bank started charging fees she couldn't explain." He paused, his eyes fixed on the judge. "I'm not a criminal. I'm a student who loves technology and wants to understand how things work. When I started looking into it, I found something that shouldn't have been there. A scheme taking money from families like mine to line the pockets of people who were already rich." The courtroom murmured again. Even Prosecutor Morgan appeared taken aback by Elijah's eloquence. "So yes," Elijah continued, "I got into their system, but it wasn't to steal, it was to reveal the truth. I sent the evidence to journalists because I knew that if I relied on people like Mr. Morgan, nothing would happen." The room erupted in louder murmurs this time, forcing the judge to bang her gavel. "Order in the court." The prosecutor stood, visibly irritated. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. What he did was illegal, and his motivations don't change that." "Don't they?" Elijah retorted boldly. "Are you saying it's more important to protect people who stole millions than a kid who tried to expose it?" The murmurs grew louder, and the judge had to call for silence once again. "Mr. Carter, I warned you to keep your composure." "Apologies, Your Honor," Elijah replied, lowering his gaze. "I just want this to be fair." Amanda placed a hand on his arm, signaling for him to calm down. But Elijah had already achieved something rare, planting doubt even in the seasoned prosecutor's mind. Morgan looked at his papers, clearly re-evaluating his approach. At that moment, the courtroom door creaked open. A modestly dressed woman entered quietly, trying to avoid drawing attention. It was Denise Carter, Elijah's mother. Still wearing her apron from her second job, she found a seat at the back of the room. Elijah saw her and managed a small smile, her presence clearly a source of strength. "Your Honor," Amanda said, seizing the opportunity to shift the tone of the hearing, I'd like to request the testimony of a technology expert to explain how Elijah's actions don't represent a broad security threat and to highlight his extraordinary skills. Judge Blake eyed Amanda with a neutral expression. What's the purpose of this? To show that Elijah used extraordinary abilities not to cause harm, but to seek justice, Amanda replied with determination, and that with proper guidance, those same abilities could benefit society. Prosecutor Morgan immediately objected. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. Intentions are not what we're judging here. I've heard your objection, Mr. Morgan, the judge cut in. I'll allow the defense to present this expert. Amanda exhaled in relief. The expert was Dr. Richard Evans, a renowned cybersecurity professor at the University of Washington, known for his integrity and lectures on the ethical use of technology. When Dr. Evans took the stand, his presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. Dr. Evans began by explaining how Elijah had used rudimentary but highly effective code to access the system. He highlighted that while Elijah's tools weren't sophisticated, they required a deep understanding of logic and programming. What this young man did, Dr. Evans said, is not something just anyone could do. We're talking about natural talent, something that, if nurtured, could lead to great contributions to society. The prosecutor tried to counter. Dr. Evans, are you saying we should celebrate illegal activity just because it's clever? No, the professor replied firmly. What I'm saying is that Elijah Carter is an example of what happens when talent meets a lack of opportunity. He saw something wrong and used the tools he had to expose the truth. If this court can't see the difference between a criminal and a whistleblower, then we're truly lost. The tension in the room heightened. Judge Blake crossed her arms, visibly deep in thought. Thank you, Dr. Evans. You may step down. As Dr. Evans returned to his seat, Elijah glanced at his mother in the back of the room. He knew he wasn't free yet, but that small victory felt like a step in the right direction. The judge announced a recess before proceeding to final arguments. Elijah sat down again, this time with a spark of hope in his eyes. The sound of Judge Margaret Blake's gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the start of the second part of the hearing. The recess hadn't eased the tension. In fact, it seemed to have amplified it. Dr. Evans's testimony had shifted the tone of the trial, and for the first time, Elijah felt there was a real chance that his voice would be heard. Mr. Morgan, you may proceed with your closing arguments, Judge Blake instructed, her voice sharp and composed. Prosecutor Daniel Morgan stood, adjusting his suit jacket as he moved to the center of the courtroom. His gaze briefly rested on Elijah before he turned to address the jury and the judge. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began. It's easy to get swept up in emotional stories and justify illegal behavior with noble intentions. But we are here to judge facts, not feelings. The defendant has admitted to hacking into protected systems, a direct violation of the law. If we begin to ignore our laws based on intentions, we will set a dangerous precedent for chaos. Morgan paced deliberately, his gestures measured and deliberate. Elijah Carter is undoubtedly a bright young man. No one is disputing that. But intelligence does not exempt anyone from accountability. He had better options. He could have reported his findings to the proper authorities or sought help through legal channels. Instead, he chose to take the law into his own hands. And now we must deal with the consequences of that reckless behavior. Turning to the judge, he concluded, we cannot forget that justice must be blind. Allowing this defendant to walk away without consequences sends the message that if someone is talented enough, they can break the law without repercussions. That, Your Honor, would be disastrous for our society. Morgan returned to his seat, visibly pleased with his performance. Elijah, however, remained composed. He briefly looked at Amanda Hayes, his attorney, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. Ms. Hayes, Judge Blake said, you may proceed with your closing arguments. Amanda took a deep breath as she rose from her seat. Her steps were deliberate, her expression resolute. This was her moment to make everyone in the courtroom see Elijah the way she saw him, not as a criminal, but as an extraordinary young man with the potential to change the world for the better. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Amanda began, her voice firm but laced with emotion. This case is not about justifying a crime. It is about understanding the context behind Elijah Carter's actions and recognizing what he truly represents. She turned to the jury, making eye contact with each member. We are talking about a boy who grew up in an underserved neighborhood surrounded by injustice. He watched his mother, a hard-working and honest woman, be exploited by a system that should have protected her. He had no resources, no power, but he had a rare skill and decided to use it to expose the truth, not for personal gain, but to help his community. Amanda paused, letting her words sink in. Prosecutor Morgan said Elijah could have sought legal help. But who would have listened to a poor boy from Rainier Valley? Who would have cared about the evidence he found? You know the answer. No one. She walked slowly toward Elijah, who watched her with admiration. Elijah Carter made a mistake, yes. He broke the law. But he did so because he believed it was the only way to do something right. And now, we are here not just to judge him, but to decide what kind of society we want to be. One that destroys talent, or one that nurtures and guides it? Amanda turned to the judge. Your Honor, I ask you to consider this. Elijah doesn't need punishment. He needs guidance. He needs a second chance. With that, Amanda returned to her seat. Elijah, who had remained steadfast, leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "Thank you." Amanda smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. Judge Blake observed the courtroom in silence, letting the argument settle. Finally, she spoke. This court will recess to deliberate before announcing the sentence. She struck the gavel, closing the session temporarily. In the courthouse waiting room, Elijah sat next to his mother, Denise, who held his hand tightly. It was rare for her to be there. She usually couldn't afford to miss work. But Elijah knew how much she had sacrificed to be present for him that day. Elijah, Denise said softly, her voice thick with emotion. I'm so proud of you. No matter what happens here today, you are the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me. He squeezed her hand, his eyes welling up. I just wanted to help, Mom. I didn't want you to have to work so hard, for us to live like this. I know, baby, she replied, brushing his cheek with her hand. But you need to understand the world isn't always fair, and even so, you should never stop fighting. Back in the courtroom, everyone returned to their seats. Judge Blake re-entered, and silence fell immediately. Her expression was serious, even more so than usual. After carefully reviewing the arguments presented and considering all the facts, she began, I have reached a decision. The defendant, Elijah Carter, did commit an illegal act. That much is undeniable. However, the circumstances of this case and the motivation behind his actions are extraordinary and warrant special consideration. The courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath as she continued. I am sentencing the defendant to 6 months of community service under the supervision of a community technology program, where he will have the opportunity to use his skills to benefit his community. Elijah blinked, processing the words. He wasn't going to jail. He was being given a second chance. Margaret concluded, let this serve as a reminder that talent can be a powerful weapon for good, but also as a warning that the law must be respected. This court is adjourned. As people began filing out, Elijah remained seated, still trying to absorb everything. Amanda placed a hand on his shoulder. You did it, Elijah. Now it's up to you. The sound of Judge Margaret Blake's gavel still rang in Elijah's mind as the courtroom slowly emptied. The feeling of relief was tempered by the weight of responsibility now resting on his shoulders. Denise, his mother, embraced him tightly, tears of joy streaming down her face. You did it, baby. You got your chance. Amanda Hayes, his attorney, walked over with a tired but warm smile. Elijah, this wasn't just luck. It was your character that made the difference today. Now you've got to show everyone that Judge Blake was right to trust you. Elijah nodded with resolve. I won't let anyone down. I promise. 2 days later, Elijah began his community service at a local tech program in Seattle. The initiative provided young people and adults with digital skills to improve their lives. The facility was modest but functional, with a few basic computer labs and a small but dedicated team of volunteers. Sarah Mitchell, the program coordinator, was the first to greet Elijah. A woman in her early 30s, her enthusiasm for the work she did was palpable. "So, you're the famous Elijah Carter," she said with a friendly smile. "Famous?" He smirked slightly, feeling shy. "Not sure how I feel about that." Sarah laughed. "Well, I hope you're ready to work. There's a lot to do here." She introduced him to the team and outlined his tasks. Elijah's role would be to teach children from underfunded schools the basics of programming and cybersecurity. "These kids need someone they can look up to," Sarah explained, "and I think you can be that person." At first, Elijah felt out of his depth. He had never taught anyone before, but as the days passed, he began to find his rhythm. Kids aged 10 to 13 packed the classrooms to learn how to write their first lines of code and understand the digital world. Elijah had a knack for breaking down complex concepts into fun, digestible lessons, earning the kids' trust and admiration. Meanwhile, across town, Denise continued working her second job. But something was different about her routine. Co-workers and even customers had started asking about Elijah after reading about him in a local newspaper. Denise didn't know whether to feel proud or nervous. "Your son's a real prodigy," one co-worker commented while tying her apron. Denise offered a modest smile. "He is. I just hope he uses all that potential for good." One afternoon, as Elijah finished teaching a lesson, Sarah burst into the room holding a newspaper in her hand. "Have you seen this?" Elijah looked confused as she handed him the paper. On the front page was a story about the fraud investigations he had set into motion. The headline read, "Seattle Fraud Ring Dismantled After Teen Whistleblower's Revelations." Elijah read the article silently, his mind racing. The evidence he had sent to journalists had led to the arrests of 4 corporate executives and launched a federal investigation into 2 local politicians. A part of him felt relief, knowing his efforts had made an impact, but another part recognized the risks this could bring. Sarah studied him. "Elijah, this is huge. Do you realize the kind of ripple effect you're creating?" "I don't know," he admitted, still processing. "I just wanted to help my mom not have to fight so hard." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're changing more lives than you realize, but remember, this also comes with responsibilities." That night, when Elijah got home, he found Denise sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper spread out in front of her. She looked up at him, her face a mix of pride and concern. "I saw it," she said before he could speak. "You exposed everything they were doing, and that's a good thing, Mom," he replied, sitting across from her. "They were stealing from people like us." "It is a good thing," she agreed. "But do you understand that now they know who you are? Not everyone is going to see you as a hero." Elijah nodded slowly. "I know, Mom, but I don't regret it." Denise took a deep breath, trying to suppress her anxiety. "Then promise me that from now on, you'll do things the right way." "I promise." Weeks turned into months, and Elijah quickly became a respected figure at the community program. He wasn't just teaching kids anymore, he was also helping adults trying to re-enter the workforce. One day, Sarah called him into a meeting. "There's someone here to see you," she said with a knowing smile. "You'll want to take this." Curious, Elijah walked into the office to find a middle-aged man, dressed casually, but exuding a confident presence. The man stood and extended his hand. "Elijah Carter," he asked. "I'm James Warren, Director of Technological Innovation at a company here in Seattle. I've been following your story, and I'm impressed." Elijah shook his hand, still confused. "What can I do for you?" James smiled. "It's more about what we can do for you. Your talent and your story caught our attention, and we'd like to offer you a full scholarship to our tech development program." For a moment, Elijah was speechless. He glanced at Sarah, who beamed with excitement. "Is this real?" he asked, incredulous. "Absolutely real," James replied. "We want to help you reach your full potential." The day Elijah began the program, Denise sat in the audience, holding back tears of pride as she watched her son embark on a new chapter. Elijah's journey had not been easy, but he had transformed his circumstances into a platform for something far greater. As he stepped onto the stage to speak to his peers, He remembered his mother's words, "Even when the world isn't fair, never stop fighting." And he never did. Elijah felt the weight of his mother's words as he stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd gathered for his first day in the tech development program. He had come a long way from the courtroom where his future had seemed so uncertain. Now, as he faced a room full of peers, mentors, and supporters, he realized that his journey was far from over. It was just beginning. Elijah had quickly become a central figure in the community technology program in Seattle. Beyond teaching children the basics of coding, he had taken on a mentorship role, helping teens like him find a purpose through technology. His ability to simplify complex concepts while inspiring others made him an invaluable asset to the program. Meanwhile, his mother, Denise, began to notice a shift in their lives. Strangers who had read about Elijah's story would occasionally stop her at work or in the grocery store, offering words of encouragement. While Denise remained humble, she couldn't hide her pride in the young man Elijah was becoming. One evening, after a particularly long day, Denise was greeted at home by the smell of dinner cooking. Elijah had taken over the kitchen, something he rarely had time for. "What's all this?" she asked, smiling as she set down her purse. "Just thought you deserved a break," Elijah replied, stirring a pot of pasta. "You've done enough for me, Mom. Let me take care of you for once." Denise's heart swelled with emotion. "You've always taken care of me, Elijah. You just didn't realize it." A few months into the tech development program, Elijah received an unexpected invitation. A local high school had requested him to give a talk about his journey, from a kid in Rainier Valley to a tech innovator. Elijah hesitated at first. Public speaking wasn't his strength, but Sarah Mitchell, his mentor and biggest supporter at the program, encouraged him. "You have a story that needs to be heard," Sarah told him. "If you can inspire even one person, it's worth it." When the day arrived, Elijah stood in front of a packed auditorium. The students looked up at him with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. He took a deep breath and began. "When I was your age," he started, "I didn't think I had a future. All I saw were barriers, financial struggles, a system that didn't care, and a world that felt unfair. But I learned something important. Barriers aren't walls, they're challenges, and challenges can be overcome." He shared his story, from the moment he discovered the fraudulent schemes to the day he stood in court, fighting to be understood. He spoke about the power of technology as a tool for change and the importance of finding your purpose. "You don't have to be a genius or have all the answers," he said, his voice steady. "You just have to believe that your actions, no matter how small, can make a difference." When he finished, the auditorium erupted in applause. Several students approached him afterward, asking how they could follow in his footsteps. Elijah smiled, realizing that his story had resonated in a way he hadn't expected. Back at the program, Elijah continued to make strides, balancing his studies with his work in the community. One day, Sarah approached him with a grin. "Elijah, there's someone who wants to meet you, again." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Another scholarship offer?" Sarah laughed. "Not quite, but it's big. Come with me." In the office, Elijah was introduced to a woman named Rebecca Owens, a representative from a prominent non-profit organization focused on using technology to address social inequities. Rebecca had read about Elijah's work and was eager to collaborate. "Elijah," she began, "we want to partner with you to create a program that trains young people from underserved communities in coding, cybersecurity, and digital entrepreneurship. Your story has the power to inspire others, and we believe you're the right person to lead this initiative." Elijah was stunned. "Me? Lead a program?" Rebecca nodded. "You've already proven that you can make a difference. This is just the next step." After a moment of reflection, Elijah smiled. "I'm in." Over the next year, Elijah worked tirelessly to build the program from the ground up. With support from Sarah, Rebecca, and countless volunteers, the initiative became a success. Reaching hundreds of young people across Seattle, the program not only taught them technical skills, but also instilled a sense of hope and possibility. Through it all, Elijah remained grounded. He never forgot the struggle that had brought him to this point, or the people who had supported him along the way. One evening, as Elijah and Denise sat on the porch of their modest home, watching the sunset, Denise turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You've come so far," she said. "Do you ever think about that courtroom, about how close things were?" Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "All the time, but you know what? I wouldn't change a thing. Every challenge, every mistake, it all led me here." Denise reached for his hand. "I'm proud of you, Elijah, not just for what you've done, but for who you are." Elijah smiled, his heart full. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, Mom." Years later, Elijah's name would become synonymous with innovation and social impact. But to him, the greatest victory was knowing that he had used his second chance to make a difference, not just for himself, but for the countless lives he touched along the way. As he stood in front of a new group of students at the tech program, he repeated the words that had become his mantra: "Even when the world isn't fair, never stop fighting." And with that, he opened the door for others to do the same.